President Trump is sending more American troops to the Middle East today, where tensions are rising between the U.S. and Iran. Thousands of demonstrators have finally left the U.S. embassy in Iraq after days of violent attacks. The unrest began with Iranian-backed militia supporters protesting American airstrikes that killed dozens of fighters last weekend. Now they're demanding U.S. troops leave Iraq. Ian Lee has the latest from Baghdad.
The U.S. is beefing up its security presence in Iraq after the embassy was attacked. But as the violence subsides, many wonder what this means for U.S.-Iraq relations. The Iranian-backed protesters outside the U.S. embassy may have stopped for now. They dismantled their camp and moved across the river. But what they left behind wasn't just parts of the compound scorched and in ruins, but also U.S.-Iraqi relations in tatters. This recent crisis saw Iran flex its muscles, revealing the extent of Tehran's influence in the country. It began when the U.S. blamed Iranian-backed Shiite militias for killing an American contractor in a missile attack on an Iraqi base last month. The U.S. retaliated with airstrikes on those militias' bases in Iraq and Syria, killing more than 24 fighters. That sparked 48 hours of intense protests. Iraqi security forces stood aside when supporters of those Iranian-backed militias marched to the U.S. embassy compound in the heavily fortified Green Zone. Compare that to the hundreds of Iraqis who have been killed in anti-government protests when trying to breach the same fortified zone during months of recent unrest. President Trump tweeted Iran will be held responsible for the attack on the embassy, but Iran's supreme leader taunted back in a tweet saying, "You can't do anything." But what America is doing is reinforcing its troops in the region, with hundreds of soldiers from the 82nd Airborne on their way to neighboring Kuwait, joining U.S. Marines already bolstering security at the embassy. That's not stopping a growing number of Iraqi politicians calling for American forces to be forced out of Iraq, which raises the question, can diplomats repair relations, or is this the beginning of the end of the United States military presence in Iraq? Tom, we're seeing Apache helicopters still patrolling the skies over the U.S. embassy, just underscoring how tense it is in Baghdad. Tom?
Ian, thank you. Now, CBS News national security correspondent David Martin is following the latest from the Pentagon. He's going to break down what this means for the United States. So, David, Defense Secretary Mark Esper says Iran-backed militias in Iraq may be planning more attacks. What can you tell us about this, and how is the military reacting?
Well, Iran-backed militias in Iraq are always planning additional attacks. What's changed here is, and Esper says, the game has changed. And what he means by that is if the U.S. sees preparations for another attack by these Iranian-backed militias, it will take preemptive action to knock out the rockets or mortars that the militias are preparing to fire into these bases. These are Iraqi military bases where U.S. troops are also located. And the last attack on one of these bases was Friday. And the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Milley, said this was definitely an attack intended to kill Americans, as opposed to previous attacks, which had just been a couple rockets fired into a very large area with no American casualties. This attack on Friday consisted of 31 rockets fired into this one base, and it resulted in the death of that one American contractor and the wounding of about 4 U.S. soldiers. So now the U.S., if it sees another attack like that in the works, will, according to the Secretary of Defense, take preemptive action.
So you mentioned acting preemptively. These militias have demanded U.S. troops leave Iraq, and the country's prime minister says he would support efforts to potentially pass a law calling for American forces to leave. Break this down for me. Is that problematic at all? Because what's the main reason U.S. troops are in Iraq right now, and doesn't that go against the missions that they're trying to carry out?
Well, U.S. troops are there. There are about 5,200 of them in country. U.S. troops are there to aid the Iraqi army in its campaign against ISIS. Now, ISIS has been pushed out of Iraq in terms of territory that it holds, but there are sleeper cells of ISIS fighters all over northwestern and western Iraq. So the battle against ISIS is not over. If the U.S. is forced to withdraw its troops by political pressure from the Iraqi government, then the Iraqi military will lose a lot of the support, not just advice, but intelligence support that it has been getting in going after these sleeper cells. So as of this morning, the Secretary of Defense said that he has had no requests from Iraq to reduce the number of troops in country.
Sounds like a really critical time for the country of Iraq and, of course, its future. David, thank you very much.
Sure thing.